time. Uh, I would like to welcome you. I'm delighted to welcome you to the event on broken borders, broken states. 100 years after Sykes-Picot. Yesterday, as you know, was the 100th anniversary of Sykes-Picot. And just like everybody else, we're doing an event. I'm Henri Baki. I'm the director of the Middle East program here. And I would like to also thank David and Marina Ottaway, whose support to the Middle East program has been invaluable and has made today's event possible. The way we've structured the conference is really, it's about yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And we will start with Elizabeth Thompson, who is going to talk to us about the keynote speech about yesterday, what Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot were thinking. And Elizabeth is a fellow at the Wilson Center. She's also a professor of history at the University of Virginia, where she studies the intersection of international relations and local politics in the Middle East. And she is also the recipient of a Carnegie Fellowship for next year, which means she's going to be not teaching another year. After her talk, we will take a 15-minute coffee break, and then we'll move to the second panel, which will be the impact of Sykes-Picot, understanding the current turmoil in the Middle East. We'll have another coffee break. No, it's not because it's boring, okay? So we're trying to keep you awake. And then we'll talk about the tomorrow, which is beyond Sykes-Picot, the prospect of changing borders. So I look forward to hearing from you. And Elizabeth, the floor is yours. Sure.
It's there, if there's that much interest. Okay, welcome, and thank you so much for having me here today to share with you. I think I'm the lonely historian on the program today, so I'd like to give you a bit of a fresh perspective from the trenches of archival research. If I can figure out how to use my thing. Where do I have to point? Forward. There we go. That's today's map. Okay. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Participants who follow me today, I've had a little inkling of what they're going to say, will speak much about the borders drawn in May 1916 by Mark Sykes of the British Foreign Office and François-Georges Picot of the French Foreign Ministry. They will alert us to the ways in which a current generation of Arabs who all learned about Sykes-Picot in their textbooks variously condemn or accept those geographical borders. And you can see, I think I have a pointer, yes, a French zone A of influence, a British pink zone of influence, French direct rule on the Eastern Mediterranean, British direct rule in the lower portion below Baghdad of Iraq and along the coast of the Gulf, and an Allied condominium, meaning international control over much of what would become Palestine in a little bit. So I do believe they will all talk a little bit more than I will today, right now, about how those are in fact not the borders that emerged from the settlements after World War I, but that Sykes-Picot was a template from which the borders would be drawn. And I am sure there will be much discussion, particularly about how and why ISIS chose to announce its caliphate 2 years ago with a video showing a bulldozer toppling the supposed border markers between modern-day Syria and Iraq, set by the 1916 Accord. However, I wish to draw your attention for my little time with you to another more profound border, which I believe has been far more damaging cause of conflict over the past century. It is a legal boundary line that haunts international law and treaty making to this day. I speak of the color line. I speak also, you'll see in a moment, a racial color line, of a different document, the Covenant of the League of Nations. It resulted from negotiations by Allied leaders between December 1918 and June 1919. Article 22 of the Covenant set down a legal line of exclusion and inclusion, drawing which nations would be permitted to join the family of nations and the League of Nations, so to speak, enjoying full national rights to sovereignty and rights under international law, and which would not. Here is a map of the League of Nations membership in 1920 when it finally opened. Here we go. Pointer. I'll master this by the end of the talk. Okay. These were bright orange back when I made up the map. But anyway, these are the mandates here and in the Middle East. So you can see Africa. There's out here as well. The bright blue territories are colonies, which are not directly members of the League of Nations. They are attached to then the sovereign nations, which were members, okay? So that the non-European peoples of the former Ottoman and German empires defeated in World War I were deemed not yet ready for self-rule, and so deprived of the right to self-determination that President Wilson had promised. These peoples would be placed under mandates assigned by the League of Nations. They joined colonies in a subcategory of humanity not worthy to enjoy full rights. Here we finally get to Faisal. I think many of you have seen this very famous picture of Faisal at the peace talks. Of course, here is T.E. Lawrence, for those of you who have interest. It was the process in 1919 by which the line was set between fully human, people who fully enjoy rights, and those who do not, that caused it. I'm a scholar of political movements and social movements. I look at how, at particular moments, particular meanings, feelings, popular political feelings, get translated into political agendas of a long duration over time, right? And so I want to suggest to you that in 1919, 1920, when Arabs were excluded and set on the wrong side of the color line with the darker peoples of the world who would not fully enjoy rights, that their response to that was written into the DNA of Arab politics for the next century, all right? And that moment has much to do with that bulldozer that we're seeing today, but it is this historical and political symbolic meaning of the way in which Sykes-Picot was imposed. And here, why would there be such Arab bitterness and fixation on this? And why would Sykes-Picot become symbolic? Because Arabs believed they belonged on the right, meaning the white side of the color line in 1919, and that they should have enjoyed legal rights. They see it as a theft, okay, a denial of their right. All right. Second reason, because Sykes-Picot was imposed by force in an era when Wilson had promised that small nations around the world would see their rights protected by law. In fact, given the amount of time I have, I don't know, we'll hopefully get to it, but it is the very instrument of international law that Wilson set up, the League of Nations, that would be used to deprive Arabs of their rights, okay? So one takeaway of my argument today is that addressing Sykes-Picot at merely the rhetorical level about lines in the sand, without going to this deeper historical meaning, does not really lead us to an understanding of Arab politics and the fixation on it, nor to what we might hope to formulate as a response at this very critical moment a century later, okay? Another takeaway, here's a parade, says Vive Wilson in Paris in December of 1918, is to rethink Americans' relationship to what Erez Manella, historian at Harvard, dubbed the Wilsonian moment of 1919, especially in light of current controversies about Wilson's own racism. Contrary to Manella's claim, Wilson was not a forgetful professor who never intended that his principles be applied in Africa or Asia, all right? He fought surprisingly hard for the Arabs to be included in the League of Nations and as sovereign peoples for their whiteness, if you will. But Wilson met racialist imperial leaders in Paris who refused to consider Arabs as white. Surprisingly, he comes off as a moderate in a club of world leaders that would also deny Japan's bid for racial equality in 1919. So the Wilsonian moment is no mere sort of moment of curious misunderstanding. Rather, it was a purposeful theft of rights, and that Americans were part of that theft. while Wilson reluctantly capitulated in the end to Britain and its dominions and to the French in excluding Arabs, his staffers eagerly signed on to their racist agendas at Paris. So we must return to Sykes-Picot through its baptism at Paris. All right? Sykes-Picot had been outlawed in the rhetoric of Wilson, who condemned, right, in all his speeches at the end of the war, the secret treaties. And said, we have entered an era of transparency, right? Sykes-Picot had even technically been outlawed, right? Russia had been a signatory to Sykes-Picot, and Russia opted out, right? And there were lawyers present in 1919 who said, this is no longer a legal document because one of your key signatories has repudiated it, right? And very famously, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, signed in secrecy in May 1916, would be published in newspapers in November 1917 by the Bolsheviks, who ran through the files of the Russian Foreign Ministry to expose the perfidy, so to speak. And it was Wilson who emerged then as a hero in Paris to stand up for what is right and what is legal, all right? And so we have to understand that in the eyes of the Arabs, right, they were the object of an illegal theft, all right? And it is this baptism, more than the actual lines drawn on a map made in May 1916, that carries the power in Arab politics. And so I'll end with some thoughts in the ways that we must then return to that moment a century later and view it as an injury and a humiliation that must be redressed before Arab politicians can see a way toward full inclusion in the family nation, toward trusting international law and the kinds and the goodwill, so to speak, of the European community, the United States, and so on. Because we without addressing this, we come as heirs to those who perpetrated the crime 100 years ago. And I'm going to make a couple, in my little time mentioned, I will speed through, and I apologize, but in the work I'm doing, I'm actually drawing some parallels in the Arab strategy to that of W.E.B. Du Bois, okay? Because he goes to Paris to claim rights for Africans and African Americans in the same Wilsonian spirit, at a time when he too is seeing rights once granted to African Americans being taken away with the extension of Jim Crow laws, right? W.E.B. Du Bois was the leader of the NAACP at the time. So, given my whole 15 minutes left, I will quickly sort of flesh out what I have argued to with 3 points. Drawing the color line, how racial politics entered into the negotiations at Paris in 1919, specifically how race entered into the debate about assigning Arab territories to European powers as mandates, supposedly temporary periods of tutelage for countries not yet robust enough to stand alone in the world. That was the way they phrased it finally. And then to review the Arab strategy and then wrap up, okay? So here we go, drawing the color line. Here we go. The Arabs came to Paris in full knowledge of Sykes-Picot and with full translations of Wilson's speeches condemning such secret treaties and insisting upon the rights of small nations like theirs. Their strategy paralleled that of W.E.B. Du Bois, who also, as I mentioned, came to Paris seeking self-determination and equality under international law that Wilson had promised the world in his speeches. Now, the very same Wilson had permitted the segregation of an integrated civil service here in Washington, D.C., reversing rights that African Americans had at the time, because he saw racial hierarchy as a natural order of things, and blacks as unworthy of equality, as children at best, backward threats, at worst, backward threats to the smooth running of democracy, okay? He urged African Americans, he loved Booker T. Washington, okay, to practice patience until they matured enough to be trusted with freedom and legal equality. We will see this very same, I'm very interested in the crossovers of domestic politics and rhetoric and logic into the international realm here, right? We're going to see some echoes of this very same sort of thinking at Paris. Du Bois, interestingly, had written in 1903 that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. All right, and he understood that not only in terms of the United States and the imposition of Jim Crow segregation in the southern United States by that point, but also internationally. He foresaw presciently, right? If you read The Souls of Black Folk and other writings of his, the era of decolonization struggles, anti-colonialism in Africa and elsewhere. He welcomed, you will see in a moment. Here, actually, let me show you the picture. Here's a picture of the Pan-African Congress. He shows up in Paris, and none of the colonies in Africa have been admitted to the actual peace conference, right? But so he sets up his own across the river. And look, he's calling on Arabs and Jews to unite against British imperialism. He had a very broad notion of peoples of color. He was delighted at the numbers of people that came, right? Interestingly, the Arabs do not come, right? As I will argue, the Arab strategy was, they correctly saw, if you wanted full rights in 1919, you have to be white. So their strategy will be to prove that they're white, and they will stay very far away from Du Bois. Just a quick note, since we are in the Woodrow Wilson Center, and to, I don't know, I'm sure you've all read the many articles in the last few months about Wilson. Du Bois actually voted for Wilson in the 1912 presidential election because he saw him as the least worst choice. Roosevelt and Taft were actively cultivating ties to Southern racists and the Republican and and their Democrats down there. So Wilson, on the other hand, played a sort of balancing game, a kind of crafty one, and Du Bois will be very disappointed in Wilson in the end, but he knew that he came to power on the strength of support from Northern progressives, so he could not actually play fully to the Southern Democrats' racial agendas. Anyway, moving on, because we have very little time. Here we go. Let's go up to here. The colonial powers justified their rule over colored populations along similar lines of logic to American segregationists. Hierarchy in the world, with whites supreme, protected civilization from the barbaric, darker races. All right? This is the era of Rudyard Kipling and the white man's burden and so on. All of the Allied leaders who met in separate councils in 1919 would be regarded as racist today. They would also commit themselves to reversing Wilson's promises of equal rights. And here's a couple pictures. Clemenceau and Lloyd George relied heavily on the manpower in their armies to defeat Germany from their colonies, right? The British recruited well over 1 million South Asians, and their numbers as high as 1 million Egyptians forced into forced labor behind the scenes, okay, in order to win. And historians agree, historians of World War I, those Europeans who look at all the European battlefields, right, agree that Britain and France would not have won in the end without the help of these troops, right? In the case of the French, it was largely African troops. But neither power would grant requests for compensation for those deaths on the battlefield in terms of rights after the war, okay? However, the color line, and this is why I think, off script here a little bit, this is for your benefit, it's not really my basis of logic here, but it is often the case that when things are unsettled and blurry, feelings become much more bitter and sharp, okay? It is, I think, in 1919, precisely because the color line was not exactly clear, that Arabs will engage, their hopes will be raised, and then they will suffer bitter defeat, okay? And one reason for this, the personal anecdote is going to integrated high schools in the city of Detroit in the 1970s, in the Q&A, okay? But look, we have Haiti. Haiti's there, okay? So, hey, there's an African country. Color line's not absolutely clear, right? If it was absolutely clear, they wouldn't have bothered, right? There would have been a different attitude. There are Latin American countries. There's Cuba, Brazil, China is at the table, India is at the table. Liberia, Siam, Japan. There was hope, all right? And then Wilson made a welcoming speech in January 1919 as the conference opened, saying it is right to meet in Paris because it is a world capital, and because, quote, this is the supreme conference in the history of mankind. More nations are represented here than were ever represented at such a conference before. The fortunes of all people are involved. So he gave a very clear signal of inclusion, all right? For people like Du Bois and Ho Chi Minh, there was a fluidity and an opportunity in January that perhaps we miss in retrospect, okay? Speaking of Wilson's speeches, we go on to the race and the mandate debate quickly. This is a summary made in May 1919 of Wilson's 14 points by an American magazine, Literary Digest. What's important to note, everybody, all literate Arabs knew the 14 points. They were all translated almost immediately after the speech was made. The points ensure open treaties against secret ones. They also, in point 5, assure the adjustment of colonial claims with reference to the wishes of the governed population. And in points 10 and 12, key, the autonomous development of peoples in the defeated Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. Autonomous development, all right? Here we go. So from the moment that Faisal and the Arabs set in Europe, they understood that they had to pin their hopes on Wilson, all right? That he was the guy, he was the game changer in a world that was clinging to 19th century colonialism. Here are the prime ministers of Britain and France, Lloyd George on your left and Clemenceau on your right. What Wilson and Faisal did not know when they straggled into Paris in the last weeks and first weeks of January 1919, is that a month before, on December 1st, 1919, Clemenceau and Lloyd George had sealed a secret deal in the French embassy in London, okay? Clemenceau, I should, but I won't because I don't have time, go back to that map, swapped control granted by Sykes-Picot of Mosul, the northern part of Iraq, and its oil fields, gave it to Britain, okay, and gave unilateral control to Britain of Palestine too, all right, which had been designated by Sykes-Picot as an international area, right, in exchange for two things. One, direct control of all of Syria, not just, a zone of influence, and number two, access to that oil, all right? The same logic on December 1st held in the case of their attitude toward race, and this is it. Clemenceau was probably the least racist of any of the men there. He had fought against colonialism in France for decades. Okay, he was known as an anti-colonialist, right? But he was a real pragmatist, and he knew that Germany would invade again. What he needed were warm bodies, African troops, so, right? And he needed oil, right? They'd all suffered shortages of oil in the war. And so it was a dirty deal, right? But it was a recognition that it was only by virtue of the strength of those colonies that they had won. All right, now Faisal and Wilson do not find out about this for months, all right? But they ultimately hold to that deal made on December 1st, all right? And it will inform policy towards the end of the peace process, okay? In the meantime, as well, they colluded, in effect, to ensure that Wilson's promise of self-determination would remain a vague promise of consulting the governed, getting their consent, right? Which is a phrase that Wilson used, but would not translate into a promise of independence. Okay, so it was collusion between these two men secretly in the early weeks of the conference. In walks a very famous man associated with racial politics, Jan Smuts, who is very, South African, had played a very important role in the British war effort, was very close to Lloyd George, and entered into the debate on mandates very quickly. He initially argued that mandates should go to Eastern Europe. He was very, and rightly concerned, he had toured the area, that creating new boundaries in this new place and combined with weak new governments was a tinderbox for conflict. And that the League of Nations should be like an umbrella supervising the relations amongst these new states, right? What he emphatically argued is that mandates should not be applied to African or Pacific Islands, barbaric peoples, right? Mandates were for civilized peoples who would enjoy their rights. But barbaric peoples should be annexed directly, all right? Guess who joins Jan Smuts? Most emphatically the Australians, okay? And the New Zealanders. They want to gobble up New Guinea and other islands that the Germans have evacuated and annex them. They want nothing to do with this stuff called temporary tutelage of mandates, right? It is Wilson who stands up against them and says, no, all right? We are not engaged in assigning war booty at the end of this war. This was a war for democracy, not to extend imperialism. It is quite impressive to see how willing he was to cause multiple stormy arguments and sessions where he's threatening to go back to his ship and head home to America and so on this point, all right? And we miss that, all right? There are a lot of contradictions in the man, and we shouldn't simplify too much, all right? But in the end, on January 30th, Wilson is forced to back down. Why? He's going to cut a deal on the mandates in order to secure support for the League. And if you read through his papers, you understand very clearly, he thinks that, well, okay, I got to do this, but once the League is established, it will be the League that will dismantle the machinery of imperialism, okay? I can't do it here in Paris. All right? But he's got to get Lloyd George and Clemenceau to sign on. All right? So he capitulates to a scheme that Smuts comes up with, begrudgingly. There will be A, B, and C mandates. C mandates are for people like these, virtual annexation. They're barbaric and no hope. B mandates are for complicated places like Palestine, where there's going to be a lot of fighting and who knows how long we'll stay. A mandates will be for places like Syria and Iraq, okay? Almost ready to rule themselves, not quite. And Wilson says, okay, but it better be really temporary, okay? And he signs on faithfully on January 30th, 1919, before Faisal can even make his presentation to the Supreme Council of the Committee. There's the map we'll skip over. All right, here's Faisal on the right. He's sent to Paris by his father, Sharif Hussein, who had cut the initial deals with Britain for an independent state in exchange for allying. Can you imagine having been an ally, fighting alongside, the British troops, only to have the British turn against you and say, oops, we're not going to hold up our deal, right? So it is Faisal who is called on to head up the negotiating team at Paris. I actually think he was a pretty savvy negotiator. All right, I've gone through these papers, and he anticipated much. He knew about Sykes-Picot. He knew because the Ottomans, in fact, had leaked word about it, hoping to cut a deal the previous summer, a last-ditch peace agreement between them and the Arabs. But he also knew it because the French envoys were very loud about asserting their traditional rights over Syria. He adopted a three-pronged strategy. One, to embrace Wilsonism against the validity of secret agreements and to establish the rights of small nations. Two, to claim Syria under terms set by Britain itself. Remember, the exchange of letters with Sharif Hussein, relatively speaking, was, it was fuzzy language, but it was written in paper, and all parties were still present. On Sykes-Picot, the Russians had pulled out, right? So he was going to stand on that. And three, to show that Arabs are civilized white people capable of self-rule in the language. So you go through his speeches, and it's remarkable how savvy he is about, what the racial politics at Paris are, all right? His memos stress that Arabs were a great civilization that had ruled an empire in the past. And here he's building on a long heritage, several decades of Arab nationalist writing, okay, that had engaged already with Europeans. They'd also argued that, according to the Europeans' own racial theories, Arabs are Semites, and Semites are classified as white. Their problem is that certain courts in the United States have decided to simplify things. Arabs are trying to gain citizenship at this very moment in the United States. And there are courts, particularly in the American South, no surprise, that say, you know what? If you're from Europe, you're white. If you're not from Europe, you're not white. I don't care about those fancy schmancy theories of the 19th century. So, Arabs in the United States are in constant contact with Faisal and Arabs here in Syria who are formulating this movement, all right? So they're able to anticipate the pitfalls, okay? Faisal met first with the American delegation on January 20th, 1919. He charmed them all, but significant for our conference today, he told them that Sykes-Picot should be tried for war crimes alongside the Young Turks who had perpetrated the Armenian genocide and the Kaiser, okay? Picot, especially, he said, had negligently left papers in the French consulate when the French abandoned Beirut at the beginning of the war, all right, in November 1914, and that those papers, once discovered, led to the executions of the cream of the crop of Arab intellectuals and politicians. They were all hanged, okay? And Faisal was in town when all of this was going on. And those had been men who were his close allies who were joining in the planning of the revolt, okay? So Faisal was located down in Arabia. He actually had grown up in Istanbul, though. He is not a desert sheikh, okay, or was not, right? But he was working very closely with the men in Damascus, okay? So being white, Faisal reasoned that, like Europeans, they should enjoy the right of self-determination. He even opposed the A mandate as an abridgment of Arabs' rights. Here's a map for you to look at. He met with a staffer of Wilson, Stephen Bonsall, and pleaded with him, don't listen, quote, to those who say that we should be discriminated against because we, the Arabs, are a wild, unruly people incapable of self-government. Quote, I am confident that, and here's what tells you that he's consciously playing the racial game, confident that even the least fortunate of our race are as able to assume this task as were the Greeks and the Serbs and the Bulgars just a few years ago. All right. Faisal met Wilson personally on January 23rd, but Wilson only made vague promises to uphold his principles, right? He was in the middle of the mandate debates at that time. Worse, the next day he met a representative from the French Foreign Ministry, Jean Gou, who engaged in a sharp debate with Faisal and asserted that the French were bound and determined to protect minorities against barbarian Muslims. The French would deploy a language of Muslims as a race to associate the Arabs with the Turks, whom everybody knew had just committed a genocide against non-Muslims, right? And Faisal, at this point, it's very interesting. This picture I have to date before the end of February 1919 because it was T.E. Lawrence who had advised him to dress up like an Arabian prince, and it caught a lot of attention, but it associated him as a Muslim with Islam. And it's interesting, by March 1919, he sets aside those robes, and he starts wearing a tunic and slacks and a greatcoat instead, all right? So the civilization, he was sensitive to the civilization side of the debate. He also played that military card, all right? And in his January 29th memo to the conference, he called himself the commander of the Syrian revolt, who had led Syrians, Iraqis, and Arabs of the Hijaz next to the Allies to defeat their enemy, the Ottoman Empire. He wrote not to ask for imperial favors, but to claim their rights of battle, okay? And on February 6th, let me give you this quote and I'll wrap up. He makes his formal presentation to the Supreme Council. Remember that the mandates have already been voted a week before on January 30th. He doesn't know it. Quote, I believe that this high court will grant justice, not that word justice, to the Arab countries as they defend their natural rights. The Arabs are a civilized people who had sacrificed their blood to help defeat the Central Powers. The 20,000 Arabs killed now deserve recognition of the independent state they had fought for. Okay? He also assured the council that Arabs were not Turks and that they will not massacre Christians. Religious differences, he said, were inconsequential. Muslims and non-Muslims had fought alongside one another in the Syrian army, and all creeds would cooperate to free their country and build their new government. Wilson was very pleased with the February 6th presentation, so pleased that he invited a close friend, the head of the Syrian Protestant College, which is now called the American University in Beirut, okay, missionary, Dr. Howard Bliss, to also present to the Supreme Council. Bliss, too, insisted that Arabs were civilized and that the conference should respect Syrians' right to choose their government by sending a committee to poll their opinions. Okay? I'll skip over a little bit on the covenant. Faisal attended the formal announcement of the covenant on February 14th. He was very pleased that Article 20, it was actually Article 19 at that time, it would become Article 22, on the control of colonies and territories, introduced the idea of mandates, but also said, quote, the wishes of these communities must be the principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory power. What Faisal did not notice, because he did not know, is that the Japanese effort to get a clause into the covenant of the League of Nations for racial equality had been denied and was omitted from what he heard that day. But to Faisal's immeasurable joy, Wilson, under the influence of Bliss, decided Arabs were white. In another heated argument on March 23rd, he insisted on sending that commission to poll the Arabs. Faisal was so filled with joy that rumor has it he drank his first glass of champagne. In his thank you note to Wilson, he said, I cannot find words in which to show our gratitude to you. Now, students will conclude. I'm going a little long. Students of modern Middle Eastern history know that a commission called the King Crane Commission was sent, but that its report was never read, and it was dismissed, and the report did report overwhelmingly that the people they met with wanted independence. They did not want France, right? If anything, they'll take Britain or the United States as a mandatory, right? Faisal had organized this Congress to meet with the King Crane Commission, all right? In bitterness, this Congress would meet again and again and again as the British withdrew their troops in favor of French troops in the fall of 1919, and they would be disbanded when the French in July 1920 showed up with their army to conquer by force, completely violating, right, that friendly, advisory, tutelary spirit of the mandates by taking Syria by force. Last note to bring back our meaning, right? This is all under the aegis of this League of Nations. Remember, that was supposed to uphold international law. And here's where we get back to the bulldozer. On your left is one of the most famous Islamic reformers of the day, Sayyid Rashid Rida. He had been president of that Congress, right? And he published a magazine read from Morocco to Iraq in Arabic, okay? Very modernist Islamic magazine. But he wrote in that magazine, if the Europeans divide us and occupy us, we will know that justice at Paris is meant only for Christians. This is the turn against international law, all right? Similar writing has emerged in the last decade, looking at the Turks' turn against human rights and international law. It is of long duration. Human rights does not have much traction, has not had over the course of the 20th century. And instead, what we have, and what is important to understand about the growth of modern Islamism, is that in inspiring, I wanted my pointer, when Rida inspires Hassan al-Banna to found the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, it is a turn against universal law and international law, and to seek a separate justice for Muslims only, since international law seems to be for only Christians only. And that, in the end, brings us back to the power of Sykes-Picot and the bulldozers on the Syrian borders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. This is a moment we're going to have a very, very, very quick coffee break. If you want, if you don't want, you can still sit here and we'll start in 6.5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I got to leave.